In this society, you were taught that being kind was something so beautiful, so noble, almost sacred. You were told repeatedly that kindness attracted kindness, that karma would return it to you 100-fold, that the gates of heaven would open for pure hearts, and that in the end, the kind would triumph. A consoling lie, a sugary, sweet illusion sold to the weak so that they remain docile, useful, and exploitable. This promise was whispered to you since childhood, embedded in your reflexes, engraved in your conscience, even before you had the time to question its truth. Your parents passed it down to you because it had been passed down to them. School reinforced it. Movies, songs, Sunday sermons, fairy tales. Everywhere the same refrain: be good and the world will give back to you. Patience, humility, sacrifice, and the light will eventually triumph. But ask yourself a simple question, a question most people avoid with an agility that betrays their fear of the answer. How many truly good men have you seen prosper without having, at one point or another, known how to be harsh? Calculating, strategic? How many times have you watched someone fundamentally kind, sincerely altruistic, get stripped of their energy, their time, their ambitions, their dignity, by individuals who possessed none of those scruples? And how many times have you looked away because facing that reality would have required questioning everything you were taught to believe about human nature and the way the world works? The conditioning runs deep. It did not settle in overnight. It was built layer by layer, year after year, reinforced every time you received social approval for being kind, every time you were praised for your sacrifice, every time an authority figure looked at you with pride because you had yielded, forgiven, surrendered. The approving smile of an adult is a child's first drug, and like any drug, it creates a dependency. You learned very early on that your worth was tied to your ability to satisfy the expectations of others, that your existence was legitimate to the extent that it was useful, gentle, harmless. This belief has not left you. It still governs your decisions, your silences, your renunciations. Look around you, truly, not through the eyes of one conditioned to hope, but through the eyes of one who observes without a prior moral filter. Who rises? Who possesses? Who decides? Who sets the terms of relationships, contracts, hierarchies? It is not the kindest. It is not those who forgave best, gave most, or waited longest in the faith that the cosmos would keep its implicit promises. It is those who understood, often young, often through pain or cold cynicism, that the world does not work according to the rules we were taught in children's books and Sunday homilies. They stopped hoping for cosmic justice. They started playing, and while you were waiting for your reward, they accumulated in silence, methodically, without guilt. This video is not an invitation to nihilism. It is not a manifesto for mindless cruelty. It is an autopsy. The autopsy of an illusion implanted within you, which for years has been costing you exactly what it claimed to win you: the respect of others, the mastery of your life, and the quiet strength of one who knows exactly what they are and what they want. Naive kindness is not a virtue. It is weakness disguised as morality. The one who gives without calculating, who forgives by reflex, who expects a cosmic or social reward, voluntarily places themselves in the position of prey. They believe the world is fair, that positive actions automatically generate positive returns, that the afterlife will compensate for earthly humiliations. Pathetic. This illusion of positive karma or heaven after death is nothing but an opium for those who lack the courage to face raw reality. The world does not reward goodness. It rewards strength, cunning, and adaptability. Notice how this conditioning operates with surgical precision. You are not told directly to be weak. Weakness is dressed in a glorious cloak. What is actually avoidance is called virtue. What is often cowardice, unable to face necessary conflict, is called forgiveness. What is sometimes a desperate attempt to buy the love or approval of others is called generosity, and you swallow it. Because the label is beautiful, because you were taught to love the label more than the reality it covers. because questioning the label would expose you to social disapproval. And you have been conditioned to dread that disapproval more than any real failure. The naive, kind person lives in a structured fiction. They have built an internal cosmology where accounts are kept somewhere in the universe, where every sacrifice will be repaid with interest, where heaven or the cosmos or history keeps a faithful memory of their good deeds and silently prepares their reward. This fiction allows them to endure humiliations without exploding, betrayals without retaliating, injustices without revolting. It is functional in a sense. It maintains the psychological cohesion of an individual subjected to conditions they cannot or will not change. But it is false, and its falsehood has a real, measurable, often devastating cost that the individual never calculates because their conditioning forbids them from asking the right questions. Let us take a concrete, mundane example that you will recognize immediately because it reproduces itself in every office, every family, every social group. The man who always says yes. The one called when someone needs a service, a favor, a sacrifice of time or energy. The one who never refuses because he is afraid of disappointing, because he has internalized that his worth lies in his utility. He gives again. He gives to the point of exhaustion, and what does he receive in return? Not respect. Veiled contempt. He is appreciated the way a reliable tool is appreciated. He is taken for granted. He is not asked for his opinion on important decisions because everyone knows he will say nothing. He is not feared because there is nothing to fear from him. And the day he dares to set a boundary, the day he says no for the first time, people look at him with an indignant surprise that betrays the true nature of the relationship. He was supposed to serve, and he has just failed his function. The naive kind become tools. They are used for their reliability, their free loyalty, their refusal to betray. Then they are discarded when they are no longer useful or trampled without remorse. Their benevolence is often nothing but fear in disguise, fear of conflict, fear of being poorly perceived, fear of loneliness. They stagnate in passive anticipation of a justice that never arrives. And the cruelest part of all this is that their very virtue makes them more vulnerable, not less. The more predictable you are in your goodness, the easier you are to exploit. The more you refuse conflict, the more you make conflict inevitable and asymmetrical, because the other party understands there will be no resistance from your side. Boundless gentleness does not appease predators. It invites them, it reassures them, it signals to them that the territory is open and undefended. Jung understood this with a depth that most of his contemporary readers have lacked the courage to explore to the end. But let us begin with an honest critique. Jung himself lived in notorious contradictions. He betrayed Freud, his mentor, with an intellectual brutality that he later rationalized in terms of the necessity of individuation. He had affairs with his patients, including the famous Sabina Spielrein, whom he later abandoned with clinical coldness. He made ambiguous statements during the rise of Nazism, statements he never fully accounted for. In other words, Jung did not live by the morality of naive kindness. He lived according to the imperatives of his own nature, his own desires, his own will to intellectual and personal power. And it was precisely this man who knew his shadow from the inside because he had inhabited it, who produced the most profound theory on human psychology of the 20th century. His thesis is implacable. The individual who represses their own darkness, who denies their capacity for cruelty, anger, cold manipulation, and ambition, does not become more luminous. They become more dangerous to themselves and, paradoxically, more manipulable by others. The repressed shadow does not disappear. It operates from the underground of the unconscious, sabotaging consciously made decisions, attracting the exact predators one sought to flee, projecting onto others the qualities one refuses to recognize in oneself. The compulsive kind person is often someone whose shadow is colossal. and whose surface light is merely a facade concealing unintegrated internal violence, a contained rage that eventually expresses itself obliquely, passive-aggressive manipulation, exhibited martyrdom, silent guilt-tripping, chronic complaining. They did not choose goodness. They suffered it as a constraint they learned to dress up as an identity. Jungian individuation, the process by which a man truly becomes himself, is not a path toward more gentleness. It's a path toward more integration, which includes the integration of everything that is harsh, dark, aggressive, and ambitious within oneself. The individuated man is not kind in the naive sense. He is whole. And wholeness includes the capacity to be ruthless when the situation demands it, without that ruthlessness destroying him from within, because it is conscious, chosen, proportionate, and not the product of an uncontrolled shadow. Observe now the men who calculate, those who lie when it is useful, who betray without qualms, who seize power without waiting for anyone's moral permission. They move faster. They rise, they possess. This is not a moral judgment. It is an empirical observation that anyone who looks honestly at the world cannot refute. History is not written by the gentlest. It is written by those who knew how to want with an intensity ordinary morality cannot contain, and who had the intelligence to know when to show that intensity and when to hide it behind a facade of moderation. Machiavelli exposed this bluntly in The Prince, and the honest critique of Machiavelli is precisely where the strength of his thought is revealed. His detractors accused him of immorality, cynicism, and the perversion of political philosophy. But these detractors forget a fundamental point. Machiavelli invented nothing, he described. He looked at the princes of his time, the Borgias, the Sforzas, the popes themselves, and he noted with an entomologist's precision how power actually functioned beneath the virtuous speeches and religious justifications. Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli explicitly cites as a model in several passages, was a man of methodical cruelty and formidable political intelligence. He massacred his enemies, betrayed his allies when necessary, used his father's religion as a tool of political legitimization, and established himself in a fragmented and violent Italy with an efficiency that his more virtuous contemporaries could not match. And Machiavelli says in substance, here is a man who understood the nature of the game, not a monster. A competent player in a world where the actual rules are not the ones displayed publicly. What Machiavelli teaches is that the effective leader must be both a lion and a fox. A lion to break what force can break, a fox to outsmart the traps that force alone cannot see. He must appear virtuous, generous, pious, and merciful, because these appearances are political tools of the highest order. But he must act according to the necessities of the moment, without hesitation, without paralyzing guilt, without the moral rigidity of one who has confused the rule with reality. The critique that can be made of Machiavelli, and it is legitimate, is that he underestimates the power of long-term reputation. Repeated betrayal eventually isolates. Visible cruelty eventually unifies enemies against you. Cesare Borgia himself ended up losing everything when the death of his father, Pope Alexander VI, deprived him of his main lever of power. But this critique does not invalidate the diagnosis. It refines it. The dark strategy works, but it requires an understanding of measure and timing that amateurs lack. Hobbes, in Leviathan, goes even further in the anthropological diagnosis. In The State of Nature, he says, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is the war of all against all, not because men are fundamentally evil, but because the scarcity of resources and the relative equality of human capacities make conflict structurally inevitable in the absence of a sovereign power to enforce order. The classic critique of Hobbes comes from Locke and Rousseau, who argue that the state of nature is not necessarily warlike, that man is born good, and it is society that corrupts him. Rousseau in particular built an entire philosophy around the natural goodness of man. But observe what Rousseau produced in practice. His ideas were co-opted by Robespierre to justify the reign of terror. The idealism of natural goodness, pushed to its political conclusion, ends in the guillotine. Not because Rousseau was evil, but because denying the dark dimension of human nature does not make it disappear. It returns, amplified, in the form of collective violence sanctified by an ideal. Hobbes, on the other hand, harbors no illusions, and his lucidity, uncomfortable as it may be, produces a more robust political thought because it is built on the reality of what men are, not on the fiction of what they ought to be. Plato, through the voice of Thrasymachus in the Republic, poses the question with a frankness that Socrates never truly manages to demolish on its merits. Is justice not simply the advantage of the stronger? Socrates refutes Thrasymachus on a logical level, showing that the tyrant is in reality a slave to his desires, and therefore unhappier than the just man. It is a beautiful refutation. It is also a refutation that requires one to accept a very specific definition of happiness, one that makes internal virtue the only true good. But Thrasymachus is not talking about internal happiness. He is talking about real power, tangible wealth, effective domination. And on that terrain, historical facts generally prove him right. Alexander the Great did not conquer Persia by being just. Julius Caesar did not dominate Rome by scrupulously respecting republican institutions. Napoleon did not rewrite the map of Europe by following the rules. These men had real qualities: vision, courage, strategic intelligence. But they also had a capacity to transgress ordinary moral norms when their objectives demanded it. And it is precisely this capacity that distinguished them from their more virtuous and historically less significant contemporaries. Nietzsche completes the picture with a lucidity that his numerous detractors have never wanted to face honestly. The most common critique of Nietzsche is that he was misinterpreted, co-opted by Nazism, transformed into an ideology of brutal domination. It is true that he was misinterpreted, but this misinterpretation itself is instructive. It reveals that his thought touched something powerful enough to be weaponized. Nietzsche did not advocate brutality. He advocated affirmation. He distinguished between the will to power as creation, self-overcoming, and the affirmation of life and simple, violent domination, which he viewed as a form of reactive weakness rather than authentic strength. But he also asserted, with a clarity his comfortable readers prefer to soften, that slave morality, born from the resentment of the impotent, was a deeply destructive force dressed up as virtue. Pity, he said, is a passion that weakens, not because the suffering of others deserves no attention, but because compulsive pity, that which is a conditioned reflex rather than a conscious choice, reveals an individual incapable of enduring their own strength, seeking in the suffering of others a mirror that legitimizes their own weakness. This analysis is cruel. It is also, in many observable cases, precise. The illusions of future reward, whether Christian, karmic, or simply social, only delay the affirmation of what one truly is. They are golden chains, and the most effective ones are those worn with a smile, convinced they are ornaments. Even Stoicism, often co-opted by contemporary self-help gurus to turn it into a philosophy of passive serenity, brings its dark contribution when read honestly in its primary sources. Epictetus, who was a slave, did not preach resignation. He preached absolute internal sovereignty within a context of total external oppression. This is not gentleness. This is radical psychological resistance. Marcus Aurelius, who was the most powerful man in the Roman world, wrote his Meditations for himself, not to be published, not to be admired. He scourged himself internally, demanded a rigor of himself that his contemporaries could not fathom, and governed with an iron fist coupled with the discipline of a monk. His stoicism was not naive kindness. It was self-mastery in the service of efficiency. The legitimate critique of Stoicism here is that this philosophy can be used to rationalize passivity. I control what depends on me. The rest is indifferent to me can become an excuse for inaction when action is possible and necessary. But in its authentic version, Stoicism is not an invitation to resignation. It is an invitation to lucid action, stripped of the illusions that paralyze. Society needs the naive kind, functionally, structurally, economically. It needs reliable workers who do not calculate too much, obedient citizens who respect rules, whose origin or true beneficiary they do not understand, emotional consumers who buy out of fear of loneliness, desire for belonging, and need for approval. The propaganda of goodness is not a cultural accident. It is deliberate social engineering, or at least social engineering that has self-selected because it was functionally useful to power structures. It produces predictable individuals. And predictable individuals are controllable individuals. Those who truly lead do not preach naive goodness to their children. They teach them how to read power dynamics, the management of alliances, the value of reputation, and how to build it deliberately. The importance of strategic posturing in every interaction. They teach them to smile in public and calculate in private, to be generous when generosity is an investment, and stingy when generosity would be a loss. The ideology of kindness is exported to the bottom of the social hierarchy. It is consumed there with fervor by those it keeps precisely where they are. Look at how major corporations actually function. In public, values, an ethical charter, corporate social responsibility commitments. In private, market domination strategies, tax practices at the edge of legality, salary negotiations, where information asymmetry is systematically exploited to the detriment of the employee who believes their employer sincerely wants their well-being. Major tech companies display slogans about changing the world and not being evil, while optimizing their algorithms to maximize user addiction. This is not accidental hypocrisy. It is the fundamental structure of any power system that requires the consent of those it exploits. The Jungian shadow returns here with particular force. The individual who has integrated their shadow, who has stared down their own capacity for cruelty, cold ambition, and calculated deception, without losing themselves in it but without denying it. This individual is infinitely more powerful than the compulsive kind person. Because they know themselves, because they know what they are capable of, because this knowledge gives them a real choice, whereas the naive kind person only has a conditioned automatism. A man who could betray and chooses not to is a precious ally. A man incapable of betraying is simply a reliable tool. There is an abyssal difference between the two, and people sense it, even without being able to articulate it. This world lied to us. Being kind does no good. It makes you predictable, exploitable, and replaceable. Society publicly values naive goodness to better produce docile sheep, while those who understand the real game accumulate power in silence, methodically, without guilt, and often with a patience the kind do not even suspect. The conclusion is not to become a mindless monster. Brutality without intelligence is also a form of weakness. The stupid predator betrays himself, reveals himself, destroys himself through excess visibility and impulsivity. Gratuitous violence isolates. Systematic betrayal eventually leaves a man alone in a fortress he can no longer leave, surrounded by enemies waiting for his first weakness. This is not what we seek. We seek durable power, and durable power requires an intelligence that simple brutality cannot achieve. No, the conclusion is to reject the illusion, to embrace a lucid, disciplined strength, cold in its diagnosis and precise in its action. Be good only when it serves you, or when you make the deliberate, informed choice to be. Set boundaries without remorse, excuses, or long explanations that reveal your need to be understood and approved. Recognize manipulators before they drain you, and withdraw without explanation, without scenes, without the naivety of believing you are going to change anyone by exposing their own nature to them. Cultivate a strategic, selective kindness, distributed sparingly like a rare and precious resource. or abandon it completely in contexts where weakness carries a cost. The scarcity of your benevolence itself becomes an instrument of power. What is easily obtained from you holds no value in the eyes of the recipient, even if they demand it insistently. What must be earned, what is anticipated, what is uncertain to come, that carries weight. That creates a dynamic of desire and attention that automatic generosity can never produce. The man who grants his trust, his time, his energy, and his affection without discrimination is a man no one truly respects, even among those who profit from him most openly. Respect is born from boundaries. Desirability is born from scarcity. Power is born from calculated withdrawal, strategic silence, and the capacity to leave an empty space that the other seeks to fill with their own movements. Robert Greene, in the 48 Laws of Power, documents with almost clinical meticulousness how men who shaped history manipulated these dynamics. The law of scarcity, the law of strategic withdrawal, the law of carefully constructed reputation. Each of these laws is an empirical observation of how power is built in human relationships. The critique leveled against Greene is that he makes explicit what should remain implicit, that he normalizes manipulation by codifying it. But this critique reveals exactly the problem. People prefer that the mechanisms of power remain opaque, available only to those fortunate enough to have been educated in environments where they are transmitted implicitly. Making these mechanisms explicit is to democratize them. And that is what the thinkers I have cited throughout this video do. They make visible what the guardians of the status quo prefer to keep in the dark. True power is born when you cease waiting for karma, heaven, or social recognition. It is born when you integrate your shadow without fearing it and without letting it govern you. It is born when you understand that authentic benevolence, the kind that has real value and is perceived as such, is not what is distributed out of fear or conditioning, but what is chosen deliberately in full awareness of what one could do instead. A man who could be cruel and chooses not to is a man others look at with a mixture of respect and caution that the naive, kind person will never know. A man who is gentle because he has no other option is simply harmless, and the harmless inspires neither fear, nor respect, nor deep love. He inspires condescension, at best tepid affection. Love itself, which has been presented to you as the ultimate reward for kindness, functions according to these same laws that the self-righteous refuse to admit. The individual who is most loved, most desired, most sought after is almost never the kindest in the naive sense. It is the individual who is most whole, most complex, most unpredictable in their benevolence and in their harshness. Unpredictability in a relationship, as in a negotiation, is a form of power. The one who cannot be entirely calculated, entirely possessed, entirely foreseen, maintains an attraction that total availability systematically destroys. Studies in social psychology on attachment confirm this. The most intense attachment forms not in total security, but in the alternation between availability and withdrawal, between warmth and distance. This is not an invitation to cruelty in relationships. It is an invitation to never dissolve yourself entirely in the other, to keep something for yourself, to respect yourself enough not to make yourself completely transparent and completely predictable. Stop hoping. Start calculating. Stop distributing. Start selecting. Stop enduring. Start choosing. Stop justifying yourself. Start acting. Naive light burns out during the first real winter, upon the first major betrayal, at the first confrontation with someone who did not receive the same conditioning as you, and who exploits your predictability with an efficiency that leaves you defenseless. The shadow, on the other hand, burns without apparent fuel, because it draws from a source that slave morality cannot reach and does not even understand. The raw knowledge of what you are, of what you are capable of, and the lucid, cold, definitive decision to never again let that knowledge be used against you by those who recognized it in you before you recognized it in yourself. The individual who has done this work, who has looked their shadow in the face, who has integrated their capacity for strength without letting it degenerate into brutality, who has understood the real mechanisms of power without losing the capacity to choose when and how to use them. This individual is something the world is not used to encountering. They are not kind. They are not cruel. They are free, and real freedom, not the abstract freedom of political speeches, but the concrete freedom of the one who knows themselves and chooses, is the only power truly worthy of the name. The world is an arena. You have always had the choice between entering it as a player or remaining in it as a pawn. The difference is not in brute strength. It is in lucidity. It is in the unanesthetized acceptance of what the world is, not what you were told it should be. It is in the understanding that the visible rules are never the real rules, that displayed morality is never operative morality, that the game is always played at two levels simultaneously, and that only those who play at both levels at the same time stand a real chance of not being the losers. It is in the precise, intimate, often silent moment when you decide, with no turning back, that your naivety was a luxury you can no longer afford. Not because the world does not deserve better, not because you have renounced all values, but because you have understood that your goodness, to hold real value and produce a real effect, must be the product of a sovereign choice and not of a fear dressed up as virtue. That moment is now, and it belongs entirely to you.